Anti-right voices filled central London this weekend as thousands gathered for a rally led by Tommy Robinson, founder of the Anti-Islam English Defence League. This drew in a huge police deployment and a counter-rally from anti-racism campaigners, eventually leading to clashes and scuffles. At least 25 people were arrested and 26 police officers were injured, including 4 who were seriously hurt. At the heart of the rally was a strong anti-immigrant message. Tommy Robinson, known for his nationalist views, told the crowd that migrants now had more legal rights than the British public. Flags filled the streets as supporters chanted, "We want our country back," and carried signs that said, "Stop the boats and send them home." The streets were packed with demonstrators heading towards Westminster, the seat of the UK Parliament, carrying the Union Jack, the red and white St. George's Cross, and some even American and Israeli flags, with others donning "Make America Great Again" hats in support of US President Donald Trump. People targeted UK's Prime Minister Keir Starmer and demanded that immigrants be sent back home. Tommy Robinson called the Unite the Kingdom March a celebration of free speech and also a tribute to American conservative activist Charlie Kirk, who was shot dead on Wednesday. Joining remotely, billionaire Elon Musk also weighed in, claiming that the UK is being eroded by what he called massive uncontrolled migration. Now, the protest comes amidst heated national debate over asylum seekers crossing the English Channel in small boats. Over the summer, anti-migrant protests flared outside hotels housing asylum seekers, some turning violent after a migrant was convicted in a high-profile assault case.
It is very important. They need to stop illegal migration into this country. It's tearing us apart. You know, we've got people here, the veterans, our veterans that fought for us and for our freedom, lying on the streets with nowhere to go. But you pop in, get rid of your documents, and you can have a 4-star hotel, free board and lodge. It is very important. They need to stop illegal migration into this country. It's tearing us apart. You know, we've got people here, the veterans, our veterans that fought for us and for our freedom, lying on the streets with nowhere to go. But you pop in, get rid of your documents, and you can have a 4-star hotel, free board and lodge.
I think the current government is a disgrace. It's taking away our liberties and making up things as they go along. I've never seen a government so disorganised.
Well, it's important to march for our freedoms. There's people who've marched before us, and you know, we want to be able to live in a democratic society.
As an education, I think we have to welcome everyone. The idea of hate is divided us, and I think the more that we welcome people, the stronger we are as a country.
And now we have News9's Shweta Kothari joining us live from London. We also have Pramit Pal Chaudhary, head of South Asia of the Eurasia Group, with us on the broadcast, and Dr. Amalendu Mishra, Professor of International Politics at Lancaster University, with us. Thank you, all of you, for being with us. Shweta, I'm going to begin with you. You're in London. Talk to us, how much have these protests affected normal life in London, considering that there are not one but 2 sets of protests, one led by Tommy Robinson and the other led by anti-racism campaigners?
Well, Krishna, I can tell you that the entire Parliament Square, the Westminster Square, up until Waterloo were affected as of yesterday. I happen to be in Parliament Square, where anywhere north of 110 to 150,000 people joined in the protest. Now, in my living memory, I've never seen so many British people out on streets. And I can tell you that for hours and hours, they tried to march towards, Southall, which is where the rally was to conclude. I'm talking about the anti-fascist rally, which saw about 150,000 people and clashes therein happening right in front of our eyes. Now, that was one rally, but then there was another rally in which about 5,000 people also joined. This was the anti-fascist rally that happened simultaneously. So the streets were completely crowded. The entire area around Westminster was crowded to a point that the Westminster Underground tube had to be closed down temporarily towards the end of the evening. So, the kind of scenes that we saw unfolding in the UK on streets were incomparable. And there were people carrying placards which talked about making Britain great again. And it was scary because, many of them were predominantly white men as well as women. So it'd be unfair if I say there were no women there. I saw veterans, I saw people out on streets in large numbers, and the scenes were quite scary. So they were talking about making Britain great again, and chants like "Whose street? Our street." Tommy, because they were there to support Tommy Robinson, whose speech concluded later in Southall at about 6 p.m. London, Greenwich Meridian time. So the scenes were quite scary.
Scary scenes on the streets of London. But quickly, Shweta, how is the situation right now, in terms of traffic, in terms of mobility, in terms of movement?
The situation is now stable, Krishna. I think by the end of the day, by about 8 p.m., the situation was quite stable to the point where the tube that was closed down in certain areas temporarily, people were moving towards their various destinations. Crowds had gathered early in the morning. By 1 p.m., they had swelled up near Westminster Abbey, but by 8 p.m., they were all back to their homes. But, the damage was done. We heard of about 26 policemen who were beaten up, who were, roughed up. Many were seriously injured. About 4 were seriously injured. About 25 protesters were also taken into detention. So it did become quite intense at some point, but by evening, the situation had normalized.
Okay. Stay with us. We also have Dr. Amalendu Mishra, Professor of International Politics at Lancaster University, with us on the broadcast. To Professor Amalendu Mishra, unprecedented scenes on the streets of London, isn't it?
Not really, because this is something that has been doing for quite some time now. Now let's look at the facts. The reason why United Kingdom came out of the European Union, because it didn't want the immigration, illegal and otherwise. So what we have seen in the last 7 years is that despite sort of having its own borders in control, it has not been able to stop those boats that the reporter mentioned about a little earlier. And there is a kind of palpable anger on the streets as well. I mean, it is not just London, but throughout Britain, you can see that the asylum seekers are more or less living in some kind of luxury, whereas people who are really sort of marginal, down and out white people, they haven't got homelessness that you can see everywhere. So it speaks to a specific kind of audience, lower middle England, and that is the reason why you saw those 150,000 people come out into the open and make their voices clear. And there are two things here. And we can also see that the Reform UK party led by Nigel Farage is sort of speaking the language that is kind of appealing to the Middle England and mainstream England to some extent. So this is going to become very normal from now on. And there is also continental support to that. You see far right rising in places like Hungary, in Austria, Netherlands, and France as well. So this is indeed something that is going to become more and more common.
Okay, stay with us. Let me just take us across to Pramitpal Chaudhary. That's, in a nutshell, what is going on, isn't it? This is a turn, a pivot in Europe, across Europe and the United Kingdom.
Yes, we're seeing the rise of a far-right politics, as has been mentioned earlier, in almost every major Western European country. France, Germany, to some degree Italy, definitely in England now, but even in places like Scandinavia and so on, where you've traditionally not had a major immigrant issue. It's partly the stagnant incomes of working class and lower middle class groups in many of these countries, very poor economic growth rates in Europe in particular. as well as, I think, I would argue, very poorly organized immigration policies. Angela Merkel's decision to allow 1 million immigrants overnight was a disaster, in my view, in terms of turning opposition or resulting in major public opposition to illegal migrants or unfettered migrants. Sweden had the same problem. And feeding into a larger thing. But keep in mind that each of these movements, there are different levels of anti-immigrant sentiment. A lot of it is about illegal migration, that the migration that does not come through a filtration system is what is triggering the most degree of anger. Denmark, for example, is a country that has had very controlled migration systems in place, and as a consequence, it has reasonably low anti-immigrant sentiment. But countries like Germany, for example, as I mentioned, which had almost had opened its door without any filters whatsoever, has now the highest levels of anti-immigrant sentiment in Europe. You could look at the YouGov polls, for example, earlier in the year. But even, for example, Tommy Robinson is interesting because Tommy Robinson is very much an Islamophobe. His focus is very strictly on Muslim migrants. He has actually said that he doesn't mind Indian Hindus, and he's a supporter, he's actually an admirer of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and has said he has, in fact, called upon his supporters to defend Hindus if they are ever attacked. So you have different elements to the way migration is thought about, but the core element remains that illegal migration without filters, without a structure at a time when the economies of Europe are doing poorly, is feeding ultimately most of what we are seeing right now. And as others have correctly said, the mainstream conservative parties, who are being outflanked by these far-right parties on literally just one issue, which is immigration, are now being forced to turn around and support those similar positions. So we've seen Macron, for example, Merz in France, Merz in Germany, and so on, Meloni in France, in Italy, slowly taking up the same positions against migration, especially illegal migration, under the pressure of the far right.
Right. Shweta, I'm going to ask you, you're in London. Can you tell us what is the chatter amongst Londoners is like? What is the chatter on social media? Because, you are talking about two sets of protests. It's not like, people in London have one opinion. You're setting two sets of protests. This is an issue, again, that is going to create polar opposites in terms of opinion making in London.
100%, Krishna. These are very polar opposite views, but taking away from what Pramit was saying, it does essentially look like right now, as divisive as it gets, the majority of opinion is in favor of or against rather anti-immigrants, because look at the number of people who turned up for the fascist so-called right-wing rally, about 150,000, as opposed to the number of people who turned up for these anti-fascist supporters and for the movement were about 50,000. So there's a disproportionate sense of people who feel that their systems are today currently burdened by illegal immigrants, and more so, this is about Muslim illegal immigrants for that matter, and not so much about Hindus, because a lot of people that we could hear, the chatter I could pick up on streets, because the streets were filled up, the Union Jacks and the British flag yesterday. Most of these people were angry about how their systems have been abused, how there is homelessness, the NHS is crumbling at the moment, there's not enough support given to veterans, but at the same time, the government is happily taking in migrants, and especially illegal immigrants. So the anger, which essentially, it started with the protest about free speech. It started with the protest against all illegal immigrants. But essentially, when Tommy Robinson was speaking towards the end in Southall at about 6 p.m., it became about anti-Muslims. So there was a lot of Islamophobia. You could hear many of these chants about Islamophobia. It's also important to mention Elon Musk joined remotely, virtually. And interestingly, all he could talk about was toppling the government, taking over the parliament. So a movement which started with the sentiment of reclaiming England essentially ended with getting rid of all the institutions. So it did turn out to be quite the polar opposite of what it was to begin with. So a peaceful march not just became violent, but also became about anti-Muslims and taking over the government and toppling the government institutions.
Right, Dr. Amalendu Mishra, Keir Starmer's government, when he came to power, was a historic turn of events for the UK. His government coming to power after back-to-back rules by the Tories. Now, his government is in trouble again.
Well, there's very little the government could do because if the boats keep coming, what is it that you can do? Can you sort of stop them coming in and drown in the English Channel? So the problem here is that the government doesn't have a proper negotiation with European Union or France for that matter. If it did, then France, which had until Brexit kept all the asylum seekers in France, could do something about it. Now, since the government doesn't have the leverage with European Union, the boats start coming in. And let's look at it from a kind of continental perspective as well. All the countries in the continent are not as humanitarian as United Kingdom in terms of providing a safe haven for those who are fleeing for whatever reason. It could be humanitarian, it could be economic, but Britain has been a soft target for quite a long period of time. And the reason why it didn't have such anti-illegal immigrant problem 6 years before is because it was kept under the wraps in France, Italy, Greece, and other places. Now, those countries are also experiencing quite a lot of anti-illegal asylum seeker policies or demonstrations or threats against these individuals. So they're kind of coming in their hordes to United Kingdom. So what the government could do, nothing much really, because we have a very, as all the panelists have highlighted, it is a democratic system. It has prided itself in terms of taking on board those who are fleeing persecution, and unless and until that is established in a court of law, you simply cannot throw them back in the sea. And we are seeing that in places like Italy and Greece, where hundreds and thousands have been killed by drowning in the Mediterranean because of government not picking them up. So the government of Keir Starmer is stuck in a scenario such as the devil in the deep blue sea, from which it cannot easily extricate itself out.
The government cannot easily extricate itself out. Pramitpal Chaudhary, what is the way forward? Because we've seen the precedent that has been set in other Western European countries, but the UK, which has already been through the pangs of it with Nigel Farage already, is set to go through it again with Tommy Robinson.
Well, Robinson, I think, remains a fringe group, but his ability to change the agenda, both for the mainstream Tory party, but most importantly for reform, is considerable and rising. Starmer's government has been marked by remarkable incompetence. I mean, it's not just on immigration. He has staggered from one crisis to another. His approval rating now, if I'm correct, is somewhere in the 22-23% level, one of the worst in the world, at least among major countries that this is measured. In comparison, for example, Prime Minister Modi is at between 58 and 72%, depending on the poll you're looking at. But he is only Macron, I think, of France is worse off than he is. And he's just lost his deputy prime minister. He's had to sack his ambassador to Washington, and the crises keep pending. It's a remarkable government that, at a time when an establishment system needs to show policy capability, Starmer is showing almost exactly the opposite. And since the Tory party itself, in many ways, disgraced itself in its own strange period between Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, you're seeing the gap, the vacuum that is being created, being filled in by Farage, who has no experience of government either, but just by sheer comparison is being able to fill that space, and his numbers are rising simply because the two establishment parties seem to be incapable of coming up with a solution. As others have mentioned, you need to be working out something with the European Union because the original source of this migration is in North Africa and the Middle East. You need to be working with the governments there. But that type of combined cooperative policy simply seems to be almost impossible for Europe to do. And since it faces both enormous economic problems, it has a war in the Ukraine, it is now facing effectively a guerrilla war coming out of Washington or the Trump administration. Europe is battered, but it has no leadership capacity to respond to even a single one of these problems, let alone all of them.
All right, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it at that. Out of time here on the conversation, Dr. Amalindu Mishra, Professor of International Politics at Lancaster University, joining us live from Lancaster. Pramit Pal Chaudhary, Head of South Asia Eurasia Group, and News9's Shweta Kothari, joining us live from London. Thank you, all of you, for taking time out to be with us here on the broadcast. Now, an Israeli airstrike has struck a residential building in Gaza City, and the army says that the Al-Kawthar Tower was being used by Hamas to monitor military positions and gather intelligence for future attacks. Footage shows the moment the building collapsed. Israel insists that civilians were warned in advance, but Palestinians say it was sheltering displaced families. Health officials report that at least 16 have been killed across Gaza on Sunday, including 7 in Gaza City, where bombardment has destroyed dozens of homes in the last 2 days. The Palestinian death toll from the conflict has now risen to over 64,800. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio arrived in Israel on Sunday amidst tensions with Washington's regional allies over Israel's strike on Hamas leaders in Qatar and settlement expansion in the West Bank.
فيما تسببت هذه الغارات إلى نزوح معظم سكان هذا الحي إلى مناطق أكثر أمنا.
Another Israeli airstrike, this time around striking a residential building in Gaza City. These are the latest visuals in the aftermath of that airstrike. The Israeli army says that this particular building, called the Al-Kawthar Tower, was being used by Hamas to monitor military positions of Israelis and gather intelligence for future attacks. However, Palestinians say that this building was sheltering displaced families. 16 people have been killed across Gaza on Sunday, including 7 in Gaza City. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is in Israel, even as tensions rise between the U.S. and its regional allies over the recent strike by Israel on Hamas leaders, negotiators who were stationed in Qatar. Tensions are also rising over Israel's settlement expansion in the West Bank amidst the war. Russia says it has shot down 361 Ukrainian drones in the past 24 hours. The Russian Defense Ministry also claimed to have intercepted 3 HIMARS rockets and carried out strikes against Ukrainian command posts, foreign legion units, and drone storage facilities. It further said that the Russian forces had taken control of Novonikolayka in the Dnipro region. Ukraine, however, pushed back with its own claims, saying its forces remain in control of Kupiansk and surrounding areas. A spokesperson also confirmed that Ukrainian troops had reclaimed a village from Russian forces. Meanwhile, Ukrainian intelligence sources said that drones were used to target an oil refinery inside Russia's Bashkortostan Republic. Authorities there confirmed a fire after the strike but said no casualties were reported and operations at the facility would continue.